The air at Fort Benning, Georgia was thick enough to chew. It was a sticky blanket of heat and humidity that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like work. For Anya Sharma, it was just one more thing to endure. She stood in formation, a slim, almost delicate figure, lost in a sea of broad shoulders and thick necks. At 5'5", with a quiet demeanor and eyes that seemed to absorb everything without giving much away, she was not what most people pictured when they thought of a soldier, and they let her know it. Every single day, her journey to this sweltering patch of red Georgia clay had been a long one. Starting in a quiet suburban town in Ohio, her father, a gentleman who taught history at the local college, had filled her head with stories of heroes, not all of them soldiers. He spoke of people who stood for what was right, who showed courage in quiet rooms as well as on loud battlefields. Her mother, a nurse, had shown her what strength looked like in the form of compassion and tireless care for others. Neither of them had understood her decision to enlist. "You have a mind for books, Anya," her father had said, his voice laced with worry. "This is a world of noise and anger." But Anya felt a pull she couldn't explain, a need to prove to herself that the strength her parents had instilled in her could exist in a place like this. The reality of that world was Sergeant Miller. He was a man carved from granite and cynicism, with a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. He moved with an intimidating economy of motion, his eyes, the color of faded denim, missing nothing. From the first day, his gaze had landed on Anya and stayed there, filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. He called her princess, or bookworm, never her name. He seemed to have decided, on sight, that she was a waste of a uniform, Sharma. His voice boomed across the parade ground, shattering the morning stillness. "Your rifle looks like it's about to swallow you whole. You holding it, or is it holding you?" A wave of snickers rippled through the ranks. Anya's cheeks burned, but she didn't flinch. She adjusted her grip, her knuckles white, and stared straight ahead at the back of the helmet in front of her. She had learned quickly that any reaction, any sign of weakness, was like blood in the water. The sharks would circle. The sharks were men like Corporal Hicks and Private Davis, two of Miller's disciples who had adopted his disdain for her. They were classic army grunts, thick-muscled and loud, who saw the world in simple terms of strong and weak. To them, Anya was a puzzle they had no interest in solving. She was weak, plain and simple. "Hey Sharma," Hicks would say in the mess hall, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "You need help cutting your steak. Those little hands look tired." Davis would chime in. "Nah, she's probably just gonna read it to death." Anya would just eat her food, her movements deliberate and calm. She never rose to the bait. She simply absorbed the insults, filed them away in a mental drawer, labeled fuel, and carried on. Her bunkmate, a quiet girl from a farm in Iowa named Sarah Jenkins, would sometimes offer a sympathetic look. Jenkins was strong and capable, but she was also smart enough to keep her head down and not draw the fire of men like Miller and Hicks. The physical training was a special kind of hell. The obstacle courses were designed for longer limbs and more explosive upper body strength than Anya possessed. The first time she faced the Weaver, a series of angled logs you had to go over and under, she froze. It looked like a giant wooden spider designed to break people. Miller stood below, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's the matter, princess? Scared of heights? Or just scared of a little hard work?" The whole platoon was watching. Their faces were a mixture of impatience and amusement. Anya took a deep breath, the hot air searing her lungs. She could hear her father's voice in her head, not telling her to quit, but reminding her of the stories. The heroes in his tales weren't always the strongest. They were the smartest. They were the ones who didn't give up. She looked at the Weaver again, not as a single, terrifying obstacle, but as a series of movements. A puzzle. She saw a path, a way to use her smaller frame to her advantage, to twist her body in ways the bigger men couldn't. She started to move, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Her muscles screamed, and the rough wood scraped her arms. But she kept going. When her boots finally hit the sandy ground on the other side, she was shaking with exhaustion, but she was upright. Miller's smirk was gone, replaced by a grudging silence. He just grunted and turned his attention to the next soldier. It wasn't praise, but for Anya, it was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. The long marches were another trial. The Georgia sun was relentless, beating down on their helmets and turning the air into a shimmering haze. The rucksacks felt like they were filled with lead, and the straps dug into her shoulders until they were raw. The bigger men, with their long strides, set a punishing pace. Anya's shorter legs had to work twice as hard to keep up. On one particularly brutal 10-mile march, she started to fall behind. Her vision tunneled, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to collapse, onto the side of the dusty road. She could feel Miller's eyes on her back, waiting for her to fail. She could hear Hicks and Davis muttering just ahead of her. "Told you she wouldn't make it," Hicks grunted, not bothering to lower his voice. "She's gonna be the reason we all have to do this again tomorrow." The thought of being the cause of everyone else's punishment was worse than the physical pain. It was a weight far heavier than the rucksack. She focused on the boots of the soldier in front of her. Left, right, left, right. She broke the march down into tiny, manageable pieces. Just get to the next tree. Now, the next rock. She started to recite state capitals in her head, a trick her father had taught her to distract from pain or fear. Montgomery, Juneau, Phoenix, Little Rock. She was so focused that she didn't realize the pace had slowed slightly. When she finally looked up, she saw that Jenkins had dropped back, ever so slightly, creating a small pocket of space that shielded Anya from Miller's direct line of sight. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, but it was a lifeline. Anya gave a nearly imperceptible nod of thanks and kept moving. She finished the march, stumbling across the finish line with the last of her strength. She collapsed onto the grass, her chest heaving, her body drenched in sweat. Miller walked over and kicked the sole of her boot. "Get up, Sharma," he growled. "The march is over, but the day isn't. Go clean your weapon. I want to be able to see my reflection in it." There was no good job, no way to push through. There was just the next task, the next demand. But as Anya pushed herself to her feet and headed for the barracks, she felt a flicker of something new. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was a stubborn refusal to break. They thought she wasn't built for this. They saw her quiet nature as weakness and her small stature as a liability. They had judged the book by its cover and decided it wasn't worth reading, but they didn't know the story inside. They didn't know about the fuel she was collecting, the quiet fire she was nursing. They had said she wasn't built for war. She was beginning to understand that war was fought on many fronts, and the battle for her own survival, her own dignity, was just the beginning. She would stand her ground. She would not fall. The days at Fort Benning bled into one another, each a copy of the last, painted in shades of sweat, dust, and exhaustion. Anya's small victories, like completing the Weaver or surviving a march, were personal milestones, but they did little to change the camp's overall opinion of her. She was still Princess, the girl who didn't belong. The constant low-grade harassment from Hicks and Davis became a part of her daily routine, as predictable as the morning bugle call. They would accidentally knock over her neatly organized gear during inspections or forget to pass on messages. Small acts of sabotage designed to make her life just a little bit harder. Anya's response was always the same, a quiet, patience. She would simply repack her gear, her fingers moving with methodical precision. She would find the information she needed on her own. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. This infuriated them more than any angry outburst could have. Her calm was a wall they couldn't breach, and it made them push harder. The rifle range became another stage for her trials. In the beginning, her shots were all over the paper. Her arms ached from holding the M4 steady, and the recoil, though manageable, was enough to throw off her aim. Sergeant Miller seemed to take a special pleasure in her struggles. He would stand behind her, his presence a heavy weight on her shoulders. "Sharma, are you trying to hit the target, or are you just trying to scare the dirt in front of it?" He'd bark, his voice echoing across the range. "My grandmother could shoot better than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. Hicks and Davis would be on the neighboring lanes, firing off tight, impressive groupings, and making a show of it. "See, Sarge, that's how it's done," Hicks would shout, holding up his target. Anya ignored them. She knew that anger and frustration were the enemies of a good marksman. She remembered something her mother used to say when she was struggling with a difficult stitch in a patient. "Don't fight it, understand it." So, Anya stopped fighting the rifle. She started to understand it. She focused on the mechanics, the science of it. She controlled her breathing, just as she did when she was feeling overwhelmed. A slow, steady inhale, a long, controlled exhale. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. She spent her free time in the evenings practicing. While others were in the rec room or writing letters home, Anya would be on the barracks floor in the push-up position, getting used to the feeling of her own body supporting weight, building her core strength. She would practice holding her rifle, finding the perfect balance point, making the weapon an extension of her own arms. She read the manuals, learning every piece of the weapon, how to strip it down and put it back together in the dark until the movements were pure muscle memory. Slowly, things began to change. Her shot groups on the range started to tighten. They went from a wide, scattered pattern to a respectable cluster, then to a tight, focused circle in the center of the target. She was never going to be the best shot in the platoon. Men like Hicks had been hunting with their fathers since they were boys, but she became consistent, reliable. One afternoon, during a qualification test, the wind picked up, whipping dust across the range. It was a tricky shooting condition that required adjusting for windage on the fly. Many of the recruits, even the good ones, were struggling. Miller was pacing behind the line, his mood as foul as the weather. Anya lay in the prone position. The wind pushing against her, she didn't fight it. She felt it, judged its direction and strength, and made a tiny adjustment to her sights. She controlled her breathing, let the world narrow to just the front sight post and the distant target, and squeezed the trigger. She did this again and again, a calm, methodical rhythm. When the targets were brought in, the range fell quiet. Hicks and Davis had done okay, but the wind had thrown them off. Many others had failed to qualify. Then Miller held up Anya's target. In the center of the paper was a tight, clean group of holes, almost perfectly centered. It was one of the best scores of the day. Miller stared at the paper for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked over at Anya, who was already cleaning her weapon, her face impassive. He didn't say a word. He just dropped the target on the table and walked away. But for the first time, the silence wasn't filled with contempt. It was filled with something else, confusion, maybe even a sliver of grudging respect. That evening, as Anya was cleaning her rifle, Sarah Jenkins sat on the bunk across from her. "That was some shooting today," she said quietly. "The wind was tricky," Anya replied, not looking up from her work. "Yeah, it was," Jenkins said. "But you read it perfectly. How'd you do that?" "I just paid attention," Anya said simply. "It's all just information, you just have to know how to read it." Jenkins watched her for a moment. "You know, my grandpa was a farmer. He couldn't always tell you the science of it, but he could look at the sky and the way the leaves on the trees were, turned and tell you if a storm was coming. He just ... paid attention. You remind me of him." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived. Anya finally looked up and gave Jenkins a small, genuine smile. It was a brief moment of connection in a place that was designed to break people down into component parts, but any ground Anya gained was hard-won and easily lost. A few days later, the platoon was sent on a land navigation exercise. They were dropped in the middle of a dense, unfamiliar forest with just a map, a compass, and a set of coordinates they had to find. They were in small teams. Anya was put on a team with Hicks and Davis. It was a setup, and she knew it. Miller had assigned the teams himself. "All right, bookworm," Hicks said, snatching the map from her hands. "I'll handle the map. You just try to keep up and don't get us lost." Hicks was arrogant and overconfident. He glanced at the compass, pointed in a direction that felt wrong to Anya, and said, "It's this way. Let's move." Anya had studied the map carefully before they'd started. She had noted the contour lines, the way the land rose and fell. She had seen a small stream on the map that they should be crossing soon if they were going the right way. "Corporal," she said, her voice even, "I think we need to bear more to the west. The topography suggests." "I don't need a lecture on topography, Sharma," Hicks snapped. "I know how to read a map. Now move." Davis just laughed. "Yeah, Sharma, trust the corporal. He's been doing this longer than you've been alive." Anya fell silent. She had a choice. She could argue, make a scene, and be accused of insubordination. Or she could follow, knowing they were going the wrong way, and wait. She chose to wait. She followed them, her eyes scanning the forest, taking in the details, the type of trees, the direction of the sun through the canopy. She was walking with them, but in her mind, she was on a different path. The correct one. An hour later, they were hopelessly lost. The terrain was getting thicker, and the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. Hicks was sweating. His face, red with frustration, he kept turning the map, as if forcing it to match the landscape around them. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, finally stopping. Davis looked nervous. For all his bravado, he was just a follower. "We should have crossed a stream by now," Anya said quietly. Hicks whirled on her. "And you waited until now to say something. You wanted us to get lost." "I tried to tell you at the beginning," Corporal Anya said, her voice still calm. "You told me to follow, so I did." The simple truth of her statement hung in the air between them. There was no accusation in her tone, just a statement of fact. It was more effective than any "I told you so." Hicks had no one to blame but himself. He threw the map on the ground in disgust. "Fine," he spat. "You're so smart. You get us out of here." Anya picked up the map. She took out her compass and took a bearing from the sun. She looked at the contour lines on the map and then at the shape of the hills around them. She was quiet for several minutes, thinking, processing the information. Hicks and Davis watched her, their mockery replaced by a sullen, desperate hope. "The stream is that way," she said finally, pointing in a direction almost 90 degrees from where they had been heading, about a half-mile. "If we follow it downstream, it will lead us to the road where the pickup point is. We'll be late, but we'll get there." Hicks looked at her, then at the direction she was pointing. He was defeated. "Lead the way," he mumbled. Anya did. She moved through the woods with a quiet confidence. Her steps, sure. She found the stream exactly where she said it would be. As they walked along its bank, the sound of the water, a comforting guide, a strange quiet fell over the three of them. It wasn't the hostile silence of before, it was something else. When they finally broke through the trees and saw the dusty road and the transport truck waiting for them, the sun was setting. Miller was there, his arms crossed, his face like a thundercloud. "Where the hell have you been?" he roared. Hicks stepped forward. Anya expected him to blame her, to twist the story, but he didn't. He looked at Miller, then glanced quickly at Anya. "It was my fault, Sergeant," he said, his voice low. "I misread the map, Sharma. She got us back on track." It was a stunning admission. Miller looked from Hicks to Anya, his eyes narrowing. He was clearly surprised. He just grunted, the same sound he'd made at the firing range. "Get in the truck. You're all on latrine duty for a week for being late." As they climbed into the back of the truck, no one said a word. Hicks and Davis sat as far away from Anya as they could, but they didn't look at her with contempt anymore. They looked at her with a new, unsettling mixture of resentment and respect. She had been right. She had saved them from their own arrogance. She hadn't done it with shouting or with strength. She had done it with quiet competence. She had stood her ground, not by fighting them, but by being smarter than them. The war, for their respect, was far from over, but she had just won a major battle, and she had done it her way. The news of deployment came suddenly, like a summer storm rolling in over the Georgia hills. The name Afghanistan was spoken in hushed, serious tones in the barracks. The air, already thick with tension, grew heavier still. The training intensified, shifting from general preparedness to mission-specific drills. The abstract idea of war was suddenly very real, a destination they were all heading toward. For Anya, the news brought a cold, clear focus. This was it. This was the test that all the training, all the insults, all the small victories had been leading up to. Their platoon was assigned to a forward operating base, or FOB, in a dusty, remote valley in Kunar province. It was a place of stark, brutal beauty, with towering, rocky mountains that seemed to scrape against an impossibly blue sky. The FOB was a small self-contained world of HESCO barriers, concertina wire, and sun-bleached tents. It was an island of American military power in a sea of ancient traditions and hidden dangers. The change in environment did little to change the platoon's dynamics, at least at first. Sergeant Miller was even more on edge, the constant threat of attack making his already abrasive personality even sharper. Hicks and Davis, though more subdued, still treated Anya with a familiar condescension, but the stakes were different now. A mistake here wasn't just about extra latrine duty. It could get someone killed. Their missions were mostly patrols, showing the flag in the local villages, trying to win the hearts and minds of a people who had seen outsiders come and go for centuries. It was a delicate, frustrating dance. The villagers were polite but distant, their faces unreadable. It was impossible to tell who was a friend and who was simply waiting for them to leave. Anya found herself strangely suited to this work. While others, like Hicks, were impatient with the slow pace of it all, Anya was a quiet observer. She had a knack for noticing small details that others missed. The way a shopkeeper would subtly move his hands when they approached, the sudden absence of children in a street that was usually full of them, the new arrangement of stones on a path. She logged it all in her mind, creating a mental map of the human terrain that was just as important as the physical one. Her Farsi, which she had started learning on her own long before enlistment, was another unexpected asset. The army had provided a translator, a local man named Tariq, but he was often overwhelmed. Anya's Farsi wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to pick up on the nuances of conversations, the whispers that happened when the Americans thought no one was listening. One afternoon they were on patrol in a small village, handing out supplies. Miller was trying to talk to the village elder, a man with a long white beard and eyes that had seen more than Miller could ever imagine. The conversation was going nowhere. The elder was being polite but non-committal. Anya was standing near the edge of the group, ostensibly on watch, but she was listening. She heard some of the women, who were gathered by a well, whispering among themselves. They were speaking a local dialect of Farsi, and they were talking about a sickness that was affecting the children in the next village over. They were scared. When the patrol returned to the FOB, they had a debriefing. Miller was frustrated. "It's like talking to a brick wall," he complained. "We're offering them medical supplies, security, and they just stare at us." "I don't get it, Sergeant," Anya said, speaking up. The room went quiet. She rarely spoke during debriefs. The women by the well were talking. They said there's a sickness in the next village. It's affecting the children. They're afraid it will come here. Miller turned to her, his skepticism plain. "You got all that? Did you, Sharma? You and the ladies at the well, having a little chat?" Hicks snickered. Maybe she was swapping recipes with them. "The official translator didn't mention anything about it," Miller said, turning to Tariq. Tariq, the translator, looked uncomfortable. "They speak very quickly. Sergeant, a local dialect. It is sometimes difficult to understand everything." Anya stood her ground. They were worried about a fever and a rash. They mentioned the name of the other village, a place called Dashtili. Miller looked at the map. Dashtili was a small cluster of homes about 5 miles away, in a valley that was notoriously hard to get to. It was considered a no-go zone, with suspected Taliban activity. "It's probably just talk," Miller said, dismissing her. "But I'll mention it in the report." Anya knew he wouldn't, or if he did, it would be a footnote, easily ignored. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the look on the women's faces, the genuine fear in their voices. She went to the medical tent. The platoon medic, a calm, competent man named Doc Evans, was there. Anya respected Evans. He was a professional who treated everyone the same, regardless of rank or reputation. "Doc," she said, "I heard some of the locals talking about a sickness, a fever, and a rash, affecting kids. Does that sound like anything to you?" Evans looked up from his inventory. "Fever and a rash. Could be a lot of things. Could be measles. "Yeah," Evans said, his expression turning serious. "It's rare in the States, but out here, with low vaccination rates, it can be a killer, especially for young kids. It spreads like wildfire. Anya felt a cold knot in her stomach. If a village had an outbreak, what would they need? Vaccines, obviously, Evans said, but also supportive care. Fluids to prevent dehydration, vitamin A, antibiotics for secondary infections like pneumonia. Why? I think there's an outbreak happening in a village nearby, Anya said, but no one is listening. Evans looked at her, really looked at her. He had seen her on the patrols. He had seen her quiet watchfulness. He had a good sense for people, and he sensed that she wasn't the type to make things up. Show me the village on the map, he said. The next day, Anya went to the company commander, Captain Royce. It was a huge risk, going over Miller's head, but she had to. She walked into his office, her heart pounding, and stood at attention. Royce was a fair man, known for listening to his soldiers. At ease, Sharma, he said, looking up from his paperwork. What can I do for you? Anya laid it all out, quickly and clearly. What she had heard, what Doc Evans had said about measles, her fear that a real crisis was being ignored. She didn't editorialize. She didn't complain about Miller. She just presented the facts. Royce listened patiently, his fingers steepled in front of him. When she was done, he was silent for a long moment. You understand that Dashtili is considered a hostile area, he said. Taking a medical team in there is a significant risk. Yes, sir, Anya said. But if there's a measles outbreak, those children will die without our help. And if we save them, that's worth more than all the supplies we've been handing out. It was the hearts and minds argument, but she meant it. It wasn't just a strategy to her. It was the right thing to do. Royce looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He saw her sincerity. He also saw the political calculus. A successful humanitarian mission in a hostile area would be a huge win. A failure would be a disaster. All right, Sharma, he said finally. I'm not going to authorize a full patrol. It's too risky. But I'll authorize a small medical outreach team. A medcap. Just one vehicle. You, Doc Evans, and 2 security personnel. And you'll go with them. Since this is your intelligence, you're responsible for it. He paused. I'll let Sergeant Miller pick your security. Anya's heart sank. She knew exactly who Miller would pick. An hour later, she was standing by a Humvee with Doc Evans, who was loading up medical coolers. Walking toward them, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and arrogance, were Corporal Hicks and Private Davis. Looks like we're going on a field trip, Princess, Hicks said with a smirk. Don't worry, we'll protect you from the big, bad measles. Anya just looked at him, her face a mask of calm. Just keep your eyes open, Corporal, she said, and try to keep up. The drive to Dashtili was tense. The road was little more than a dirt track winding through a narrow canyon. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Hicks drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Davis was in the turret, constantly scanning the ridges above them. Anya sat in the back with Doc Evans, her rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning everything, the rocks, the shadows, the sky. She wasn't just looking for threats. She was looking for confirmation, and she saw it. On a rock by the side of the road, someone had placed a small piece of red cloth. It was one of the details she had noticed in the first village. The women used these small red cloths as prayer tokens, tying them to things when they were praying for health. It was a sign. They were on the right path. When they finally rolled into the village of Dashtili, it was like entering a ghost town. It was eerily quiet. Then they heard it. A faint, weak sound, the sound of a child crying. The village elder came out to meet them, his face a mask of fear and suspicion. But when he saw Doc Evans, with his Red Cross armband, and Anya, a woman, his expression softened slightly. Anya spoke to him in her careful Farsi, explaining that they had heard about the sickness and had come to help. The elder led them to a long, low mud brick building. The air inside was hot and still, and filled with the sound of quiet suffering. On mats on the floor lay a dozen small children, their faces flushed with fever, their bodies covered in the telltale red rash. Their mothers sat beside them, fanning them, their faces etched with a grief that needed no translation. Anya had been right. It was measles. Doc Evans went to work immediately, his movements calm and efficient. He started administering vitamin A and checking for pneumonia. Hicks and Davis stood guard by the door, their tough guy personas forgotten, their faces pale and shaken by the sight of so many sick children. Anya moved through the room, speaking to the mothers in a low, soothing voice. She helped them get water for the children, showed them how to cool their fevers with damped cloths. She wasn't a soldier in that moment. She was her mother's daughter, a bringer of comfort in a room full of pain. Her quiet competence, her gentle way with the mothers and children, did not go unnoticed. The villagers, who had been hostile and suspicious, began to soften. They brought the soldiers water and bread. The elder watched Anya, his old eyes filled with a new understanding. They worked for hours, until the sun began to set. They had done what they could. They had stabilized the worst cases and left enough medicine for the others. As they were packing up to leave, the elder came to Anya. He took her hand and said something in Farsi. Hicks, standing nearby, asked, "What did he say?" Anya looked at the old man's grateful face. He said, "You have the eyes of a warrior and the heart of a mother. You are a new kind of soldier, As they drove back to the fob in the fading light, no one spoke. The usual banter was gone. Hicks and Davis were silent, lost in their own thoughts. They had gone on the mission expecting to prove Anya wrong, to see her fail. Instead, they had seen her be more effective than any of them could have been. She hadn't used a weapon. She had used her intelligence, her observation, and her compassion. She had seen a threat no one else had seen, and had saved lives because of it. They said she wasn't built for war, but they were beginning to understand that war was more than just fighting. It was about seeing the whole battlefield, the human one, as well as the physical one. And on that battlefield, Anya Sharma was proving to be a formidable soldier indeed. The successful medical mission to Dashti Lee should have been a turning point for Anya in a just world. It would have earned her the respect she deserved. Captain Royce was pleased, and the official report praised her initiative and cultural awareness. But in the small, closed world of the platoon, things were more complicated. Respect, once lost, is not easily regained, and prejudice runs deep. Sergeant Miller saw her success not as an asset to the platoon, but as a challenge to his authority. She had gone over his head. She had been right when he had been wrong. In his eyes, this made her dangerous, an unpredictable element in a world that ran on hierarchy and obedience. His hostility didn't lessen. It curdled, becoming something colder and more calculating. He stopped calling her princess and started calling her Sharma. But he said her name with a sharp, dismissive edge that was its own kind of insult. Hicks and Davis were caught in the middle. They had seen what Anya could do. They had witnessed the gratitude of the villagers and the quiet, steely competence she possessed. They couldn't deny what they had seen, but siding with her would mean siding against Miller, and that was a line they weren't prepared to cross. So they resorted to a sullen silence, avoiding her when they could and treating her with a wary, resentful distance when they couldn't. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. Intelligence came down from command about a high-valued target, a local Taliban commander named Muller Zat, who was believed to be operating in their sector. Zat was responsible for a series of IED attacks that had killed several American soldiers. Getting him was a top priority. A new patrol was scheduled, a kill or capture mission into a network of caves in the mountains where Zat was thought to be hiding. It was the most dangerous mission they had yet faced. The entire platoon was to go. Miller gave the briefing, his voice tight with excitement. This was the kind of war he understood. A clear enemy, a clear objective. He laid out the plan of attack. It was a classic hammer and anvil strategy. 2 squads would assault the cave entrance directly, while a third, a support team, would circle around and set up a blocking position on the ridge above, cutting off any escape route. Sharma, Miller said, his eyes locking onto hers. With the support team, you'll be on the radio. Don't screw it up. It was a critical job, but it was also a backseat role. He was putting her on the sidelines. Anya just nodded. Yes, Sergeant. The support team was small. Anya Jenkins and 2 other soldiers, led by a young by-the-book lieutenant named Wallace. Their job was to climb the treacherous goat path to the ridge, set up an observation post, and relay information to Miller's assault teams below. The climb was brutal, a steep ascent over loose rock and shale. They moved under the cover of darkness, the only sounds the crunch of their boots and their own labored breathing. Anya felt a familiar sense of focus settle over her. She wasn't thinking about Miller or Hicks. She was thinking about the mission, about the terrain, about the weight of the radio on her back. They reached the ridge just before dawn and set up their position behind a rocky outcrop that gave them a perfect view of the cave entrance below. Anya set up the radio, running a comms check with Miller's team. His voice came through the headset, tinny and impatient. Support team in position. This is support. We are in position. We have eyes on the target area, Anya replied, her voice calm and professional. Good. Stay off the net unless you have something important to say, Miller ordered. Assault teams are moving in. Through her binoculars, Anya watched as the 2 assault squads, little more than dark shapes in the pre-dawn gloom, began their slow, careful approach to the cave. The valley was silent, unnervingly so. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like a held breath. And then Anya saw it. It was a tiny detail, something that would have been easy to miss. On the face of the cliff, about 50 yards to the left of the main cave entrance, was a small, dark fissure, almost completely hidden by a scrubby bush. It looked like a shadow, nothing more. But as she watched, she saw a flicker of movement, a puff of dust, as if a stone had been dislodged from inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was another entrance, a back door. The plan, the hammer and anvil, was flawed. The enemy wasn't trapped. They had an escape route, or worse, a place to set up a flanking position. Sergeant Miller, this is support, she said into the radio, her voice urgent but controlled. I have eyes on a possible secondary entrance to the cave system, approximately 50 meters west of the main opening. Miller's voice came back, laced with annoyance. Support, I told you to stay off the net. We've studied the satellite imagery. For weeks there's only one entrance. You're probably looking at a shadow. Negative, Sergeant, Anya insisted. I saw movement. I recommend you hold your position and send a scout to verify. Negative, support, Miller shot back, his voice rising. We are not holding. We are 5 minutes from the breach. Stick to your job and keep your eyes on the main entrance. That's an order. Miller out. The line went dead. Anya stared at the radio in disbelief. He had dismissed her, completely and utterly. Lieutenant Wallace, who had heard the exchange, looked at her, his face worried. You heard him, Sharma. We have our orders. Anya looked back through her binoculars at the fissure in the rock. Her gut, the same instinct that had told her the team was lost in the woods, the same instinct that had told her the villagers were sick, was screaming at her. Miller was walking his men into a trap. She had a choice, a terrible career-ending life-or-death choice. She could obey the order, stay silent, and watch as her platoon was potentially flanked and cut to pieces. Or she could disobey a direct order in a combat situation, an act of insubordination that could land her in prison. She thought of her father's stories. The heroes weren't the ones who always followed orders, they were the ones who did what was right, no matter the cost. She looked at Jenkins, who was watching her, her eyes wide. Jenkins had seen Anya be right before. She trusted her, Lieutenant Anya said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. Sergeant Miller is wrong. I know he is. They're walking into an ambush. What are you going to do? Wallace asked, his voice barely a whisper. Anya took a deep breath. I'm going to do my job, she said. My job is to support the assault team, and right now, the best way to support them is to warn them. She switched the radio to the platoon-wide frequency, a channel that everyone, including Captain Royce back at the FOB, could hear. It was a desperate, irreversible move. All stations, this is support, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. Be advised, there is a confirmed secondary opening to the target location. I say again, a confirmed secondary opening. It is a fatal funnel. The assault plan is compromised. Repeat, the assault plan is compromised. The radio exploded with noise, Miller's voice, roaring with fury. Sharma, I will have you court-martialed. Get off this net. But it was too late. Just as Miller was screaming at her, a muzzle flash erupted from the fissure in the rock. Then, another, a machine gun opened up, its deadly chatter echoing through the valley. It was a perfect crossfire, catching the first assault team, Miller's team. In the open, the radio became a chaos of shouting, of calls for a medic, of the terrifying sounds of a firefight gone wrong. Anya had been right. It was a trap. Up on the ridge, Lieutenant Wallace was frozen, his face ashen, but Anya was moving. The decision had been made, and now there was only action. Jenkins lay down suppressive fire on that secondary position, she yelled, her voice cutting through the noise. Lieutenant, we need to give them a target. She grabbed a smoke grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it with all her might. It landed on the rocks just below the machine gun nest, billowing a thick cloud of purple smoke, obscuring the enemy's view. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a chance for Miller's men to find cover. Down below, the battle raged. Anya stayed on the radio, her voice suddenly the only calm, coherent thing in the chaos. She relayed enemy positions as she saw them, coordinating fire, directing the second assault team to provide cover for the first. She was no longer just a radio operator. She was the eyes of the platoon, the nerve center of the battle. She had been told she wasn't built for war, but now, with bullets flying and lives on the line, she was the one holding them all together. She had stood her ground. She had refused to fall silent. She had disobeyed in order to save the lives of the very men who had mocked her, including the man who had just threatened to ruin her life. In the heart of the fire, she had found her voice, and it was the voice of a true soldier. The consequences would be severe, she knew that, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was getting her people home. The firefight felt like an eternity, a compressed nightmare of noise, fear, and adrenaline. Up on the ridge, Anya, Jenkins, and the others provided what cover fire they could, their bullets kicking up dust around the enemy machine gun nest. Down in the valley, under the shield of Anya's smoke grenade and the covering fire, Miller's team scrambled for cover, dragging their wounded with them. The element of surprise was gone for both sides. The battle devolved into a brutal stalemate. Anya stayed on the radio, a lifeline of calm in the storm. Second squad, enemy combatant visible, top of the rocks. You're 10 o'clock, she'd say, her voice even. First squad, be advised. You have wounded moving into the wadi on your left. She was painting a picture for them, helping them see the battlefield. From her vantage point, she wasn't just relaying information. She was directing traffic in a hurricane. The standoff was finally broken by the roar of Apache helicopters, called in by Captain Royce, who had heard Anya's desperate platoon-wide broadcast. The helicopters swooped in, their cannons tearing into the mountainside. The enemy, outgunned and exposed, melted back into the caves. The battle was over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whir of the helicopter blades and the cries of the wounded. The cost was high. 2 men were killed and 5 were wounded, including Sergeant Miller, who had taken a piece of shrapnel to his leg. It could have been so much worse. If the machine gun nest had gone unnoticed for another minute, it would have wiped out the entire lead squad. Everyone knew it. The journey back to the FOB was grim and silent. The wounded were evacuated by helicopter, while the rest of the platoon walked back, their bodies heavy with exhaustion and their minds reeling from the trauma of the fight. Anya walked among them, her face a stoic mask. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She was an outcast, a pariah who had committed the cardinal sin of disobeying a direct order in combat. She had saved their lives, but she had broken the code. Back at the FOB, she was immediately summoned to Captain Royce's office. She was ordered to surrender her weapon and was confined to her quarters, pending an official investigation. As she walked to her tent, she could feel the eyes of the entire platoon on her. They were a mixture of anger, confusion, and for a few, a reluctant gratitude they dared not show. Her bunkmate Jenkins was there when she arrived. "They can't be serious," Jenkins said, her voice filled with disbelief. "You saved us." "I was there. I saw it. I disobeyed an order." "Sarah," Anya said, her voice weary. She sat on her bunk, the weight of the day finally crashing down on her. "In their eyes, that's all that matters." "But it was a bad order," Jenkins insisted. "It would have gotten us all killed." "It doesn't matter," Anya said. "The system has to protect itself. They can't have soldiers making their own decisions on the battlefield. It's chaos." She understood the logic of it, even as it was crushing her. The investigation began the next day. It was a formal, sterile process. A grit major from another unit was brought in to conduct the interviews. He spoke to everyone, from Lieutenant Wallace to Privates Hicks and Davis. Anya was interviewed last. She sat in a small, hot tent, the major on the other side of a folding table, and told her story. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame. Miller should just stated the facts, calmly and clearly. "I saw a threat that was not on the map," she said. "I communicated that threat to my superior. My warning was disregarded. I had reason to believe that following the order to remain silent would result in the deaths of multiple soldiers. I made a decision to break radio silence on a platoon-wide net to ensure the warning was heard by all parties. I believed it was the only way to prevent a catastrophic loss of life." The major listened, his face impassive, taking notes. "You are aware, Private Sharma, that the penalty for disobeying a direct order in a combat zone can be a dishonorable discharge and imprisonment." "Yes, sir," Anya said, her voice not wavering. "I am." The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Anya was isolated, a ghost in her own platoon. The only person who would speak to her was Jenkins, who would bring her food and news. From the outside, the sentiment in the platoon was deeply divided. The newer soldiers, the ones who had been in the kill zone, were quiet. They knew what they owed her. But the older guard, the ones loyal to Miller, were openly hostile. Hicks and Davis were the most conflicted of all. They had built their identities around the idea that Anya was weak and incompetent. But they had been there, in the valley. They had heard her calm voice on the radio while they were scrambling for their lives. They had seen the bodies of their friends. Their certainty was shattered, and it left them angry and confused. One evening, Hicks came to her tent. He stood at the entrance, shifting his weight, unable to look her in the eye. "The guys, some of them are saying you should be in jail," he mumbled. Anya looked up from the book she was reading. "And what do you say, Corporal?" Hicks kicked at the dirt. "I say I was there, I heard Miller, I heard you, and I'm alive." He looked up, and for the first time, she saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. It was shame. "I was a real jerk to you, Sharma. I am sorry." He turned and walked away before she could respond. It wasn't a promise of help. It wasn't a public defense. But it was a crack in the wall of hostility. A small acknowledgement of the truth. The real battle was being fought in the minds of the men she had served with, and the key witness was Sergeant Miller. He was recovering in the medical wing, his leg propped up on pillows. Captain Royce went to see him. He needed Miller's official statement. The whole case rested on it. Miller was bitter. His leg throbbed with pain, but his pride was what was truly wounded. A private, a girl he had dismissed as a princess, had shown him up, had saved his men from his own mistake. Admitting that was a pill he could not swallow. "She's a loose cannon, sir," Miller told Royce, his voice raspy. "She panicked. She got on the radio and caused chaos. If she had just followed orders, we would have handled it." "Handled it?" Royce asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sergeant, you were walking into a crossfire that would have annihilated your squad. Her panic saved your life. And you know it." "She broke the chain of command," Miller insisted, his jaw tight. "There's no coming back from that. She doesn't belong here. I said it from day one." Royce looked at the man in the bed, a man so blinded by his own prejudice that he was willing to sacrifice the career and freedom of a soldier who had saved him. He saw the smallness of him, the brittle ego. "The investigation will run its course," Sergeant Royce said, his voice cold. "Give your official statement to the major. Just be sure it's the truth, because every man in that valley knows what the truth is, and it has a way of coming out." Royce left Miller alone in the quiet of the medical tent. The physical war was over, for now. But the war for justice, the war for Anya's future, was just reaching its climax. Anya had stood her ground on the battlefield. Now, isolated and alone, she had to trust that the truth would do the same. She had to trust in the character of the men she had served with, even those who had wished for her to fail. Her fate was in their hands. The investigation dragged on, casting a long shadow over the entire platoon. The official recommendation from the investigating major was delivered to Captain Royce in a sealed envelope. Given Sergeant Miller's official statement, which painted Anya as an insubordinate soldier who panicked, the recommendation was harsh: a general court-martial on charges of willful disobedience of a superior officer in a combat zone. The path was laid for Anya's ruin. Her career would be over, and she would likely face prison time. Captain Royce read the report in his office, a deep sense of unease settling over him. He was a good officer, a man who believed in the system, but he also believed in his soldiers. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond reports and regulations, that Anya Sharma was one of the best he had ever served with. He looked at the report, then at the list of witnesses. He knew that the official statements didn't always tell the whole story. The news of the impending court-martial spread quickly through the FOB. A grim mood settled over the soldiers. For those who had been in the valley, the injustice was a bitter pill to swallow. They owed her their lives, and the army was going to crucify her for it. They started talking, not in the open, but in quiet corners of the mess hall, in the darkness of their tents. They talked about what they had seen, what they had heard. They talked about the calm in her voice when all hell was breaking loose. The first to break ranks was, surprisingly, Corporal Hicks. The shame that had been eating at him finally won out over his fear of reprisal. He went to see Captain Royce, standing stiffly at attention in front of his desk. "Sir," he began, his voice unsteady, "my official statement, it wasn't the whole truth. I was trying not to contradict Sergeant Miller, but it's not right. What's happening to Sharma is not right." Royce just listened, his expression giving nothing away. "She saved us," Sir Hicks continued, his words coming in a rush. "Plain and simple, Miller was gonna get us all killed. He was so focused on the front door he couldn't see what was right in front of him, but she saw it. She tried to warn him, and he shut her down. Her getting on that radio was the only reason any of us from First Squad are still here." He finally looked Royce in the eye. "I was awful to her, sir. We all were. We judged her because she wasn't like us. But it turns out she was better." After Hicks, the dam broke. One by one, then in small groups, the soldiers from the patrol went to Captain Royce. Private Davis, his usual bravado gone, mumbled his own confession. Lieutenant Wallace, the young officer from the support team, gave a detailed account of Anya's certainty and professionalism in the face of Miller's angry dismissal. Even Jenkins, who had already supported Anya, gave a new, more forceful statement. They were no longer willing to let a good soldier be sacrificed to protect a bad leader's pride. Armed with this new testimony, Captain Royce went to the base commander, a full colonel. He laid out the situation, the official report, Miller's statement, and the contradictory, heartfelt testimony of nearly a dozen men who had been on the ground. "Sir," Royce said, "we have two stories here. One is from a sergeant with a wounded leg and a wounded ego. The other is from the men whose lives were saved. I believe the men." The colonel, a veteran of 3 tours, listened intently. He knew that the truth on the battlefield was often messy, and that the regulations didn't always account for the complexities of human courage. He made a decision. He wasn't going to convene a court-martial. Instead, he was going to hold a formal Article 15 hearing. It was a non-judicial proceeding, less severe than a court-martial, but still serious. It would be a final review of the facts, and he himself would preside. Everyone involved would be there. The hearing was held in a large makeshift briefing tent. It was packed. The entire platoon was there, standing in the back. Anya stood before a long table, Captain Royce by her side as her counsel. At the other end of the table sat Sergeant Miller, his leg in a cast, his face a mask of defiant anger. In the center sat the base commander. The commander started by reading the official charge: willful disobedience of an order. Then he looked at Miller. "Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his rank, "please recount the events of the mission." Miller told his version of the story, the same one he had been telling all along. He portrayed Anya as a nervous, unreliable soldier who overreacted to a shadow and violated protocol, endangering the mission. He spoke with conviction, but his eyes kept darting around the room, avoiding the gazes of the men from his own squad. Then the commander looked at Anya. "Private Sharma, your response." Anya stood tall, her voice quiet but clear. She recounted the events, just as she had experienced them, ending with her decision to break radio silence. "Sir," she concluded, "I was aware of the consequences of my actions. But I was also aware of the consequences of inaction. I chose to risk my career to protect the lives of my fellow soldiers. I stand by that decision." The commander was silent for a moment, then he said, "Corporal Hicks, step forward." Hicks walked to the table, his face pale. He looked not at the commander, but at Miller. "Sergeant," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "you were wrong. We were all wrong about her. She tried to save you from yourself." Then he turned to the commander and told the truth, his voice growing stronger with every word. One by one, the commander called them up: Davis, Wallace, Jenkins. Each one told the same story. a powerful chorus of truth that drowned out Miller's lies. They spoke of Anya's Tom, her precision, her courage. They spoke of their own prejudice and their profound regret. The tent was silent when they were done. The weight of their testimony was overwhelming. The commander looked at Sergeant Miller, whose face had gone from defiant to ashen. The foundation of his authority, built on bluster and intimidation, had crumbled into dust. "Sergeant Miller," the commander said, his voice cold as steel, "you have not only demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment in the field, you have actively attempted to conceal your failure by destroying the career of a soldier who corrected your mistake. You have lied to your commanding officers and betrayed the trust of your men. You are a disgrace to this uniform." He then turned to Anya. "Private Sharma," he said, his tone softening, "you stood your ground. You trusted your instincts, and you made the right call under unbearable pressure. The charge against you is dismissed, with prejudice." A wave of relief washed over Anya, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. "Furthermore," the commander continued, his voice ringing through the tent, "for your exceptional courage, your clarity, under fire, and for actions that directly saved the lives of at least 6 soldiers, I am awarding you the Army Commendation Medal with Valor." A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a spontaneous eruption of applause from the soldiers in the back. It started with Hicks and Jenkins and quickly spread through the entire platoon. They were clapping for her, their faces filled with a respect that was genuine and hard-earned. Sergeant Miller was relieved of his command and would face his own disciplinary action. His career was over. Later that day, Anya stood on the parade ground, the same dusty ground where Miller had once mocked her. The whole platoon was assembled, but this time, it was different. The commander pinned the medal on her chest. As she stood there, she looked out at the faces of the men she served with. She saw Hicks and Davis, who gave her a slow, respectful nod. She saw Jenkins, beaming with pride. She saw a unit that had been broken by prejudice and was now being healed by the truth. They had said she wasn't built for war. They had looked at her and seen weakness. But war had revealed what was truly inside her. Not the brute strength of a clenched fist, but the unyielding strength of a character that refused to break. A mind that saw what others missed. And a heart that understood that the greatest courage is not in the willingness to fight, but in the wisdom to know when and how to stand your ground. She had refused to fall, and in doing so, she had taught them all the true meaning of being a soldier.